So are we good to go, Sean?
Yes, I'm just letting everyone in now, Aileen.
Okay. Right, so you're all very welcome to this important seminar to celebrate, but also to discuss and engage with a wonderful report written by Professor Oren Doyle and Professor David Kenny from Trinity, together with Professor Christopher McCrudden from Queen's University Belfast and Professor Fionnuala Ní Ealaun from the University of Minnesota and Queen's. We're delighted to have all of the authors of this report with us today to discuss the report and field questions. The title of the report is Legal Convergence and Divergence on the Island of Ireland, and it explores the larger themes, which of course we as constitutional lawyers must grapple with in the constitutional moment in which we live, but it also drills down into some detail on specific issues under 8 different headings. And of course, in thinking about constitutional futures, we need both the detail and the larger sweep of themes. I should say that this report and the project as a whole has been supported and funded by a number of different institutions. And this is in a way an indication of how important this theme is and how many actors, North, South, East and West, are interested in and must be engaged in these questions. The funding support comes from, first, the Senator George Mitchell Institute for Global Peace, Security and Justice at Queen's University Belfast, the Irish Research Council based in Dublin, and the Shared Island Unit in the Department of An Taoiseach. I should also say that this seminar and the report is also supported by TriCON, the Trinity Centre for Constitutional Governments, and the Jean Monnet Centre of Excellence in Law and Politics here at Trinity College Dublin. So we have the authors of this report and a unique opportunity to engage with them. And to kick off discussion, we also have 2 esteemed commentators. The first is Professor Colin Harvey from Queen's University Belfast, and the second is Professor Aileen McCarg from the University of Durham. So without more ado, I'll hand over to Professor Colin Harvey from Queen's University Belfast, who's going to talk to us for about 10 to 15 minutes on his reaction to this report, followed by Professor McCarg's comments, and then we'll open it out to the floor for questions. So please keep your questions and raise your hand for me if you want to ask them later on in the seminar. So over to you, Colin.
Thank you, Aileen, and thank you to the authors of this report, Oren, David, Chris and Fionnuala, for the invitation to comment and to participate in the discussion this evening. Legal convergence and divergence on the island of Ireland is a very welcome contribution. This project is doing essential work, and I want to take this opportunity this evening to commend the authors and to commend all participants for their focused engagement and the challenging legal questions that they have been grappling with. And of course, not to forget the funders who have been supporting it. What I'll do this evening is to do some scene setting and add some comments. The discussion that we're having and this work is framed by the Belfast Good Friday Agreement and the distinctive legal traditions and contexts in each jurisdiction on the island of Ireland. The institutions, values, principles, and obligations of the agreement remain fundamental and remain foundational. An agreement that's about connections on this island and across these islands. In this report, in the list of members and discussants, I see connections and relationships with people, ones that I've forged in my own work and life over many, many years. In other words, a safe haven of peers, friends, and colleagues. The agreement leaves the constitutional future of Northern Ireland open-ended, putting in place special arrangements that absorb and reflect complexity and nuance. So these are some of my thoughts, and they are my own thoughts, and the authors and participants should not be blamed either for me or for my comments. First, the shared island framing of the funding in the project is helpful. It does not prejudge any particular constitutional outcome, and the report authors are clear on that point throughout in their own framing and on the questions of divergence and convergence. There must be, and there can be, more planning on how the island is shared in practically sensible ways now for the benefit of all of those who live in and on it, and better preparation for already anticipated potential constitutional outcomes, plural, not an either-or conversation. Those involved in projects like this will have myriad personal preferences and a right to them. My own view, not being ready for an envisaged outcome, the Irish state is already constitutionally committed to, seems foolish and, after Brexit, dangerously irresponsible. Equally, using the language of a shared island in purely gestural terms, devoid of substantive commitment, is unwise and profoundly unhelpful. Brexit has sharpened the focus in these discussions and increased the serious concerns of more intense divergence. We've even heard language like repartition of the island. This is practical work that needs to be done, and those using the language of sharing on the island really must mean it. Do not raise expectations, particularly on this part of the island, if you don't intend to meet them. Second, there's acknowledgement in this impressive report of limitations on areas not covered here and on the comprehensiveness of those addressed. I'd push this a wee bit further this evening. Universities have an absolutely vital role. Academics bringing expertise and knowledge from years, even decades of forensic study and research. The call that we sometimes hear, however, to land all this work entirely at the virtual or physical door of academic institutions should be approached with a measure of caution and scholarly humility. There's a pressing need for wider and deeper civic engagement across the island and much more proactive governmental action. Again, this isn't an either-or discussion, and our universities, particularly the one that I work in, they're commendably socially engaged, but there are limits. Third, I agree with the authors when they say, quote, there is scope, however, for more focused research on critical legal challenges that would arise in the context of Irish unification, end quote. Work that unapologetically, in my view, recognises that Irish reunification is a possible future that needs to be planned for, whether you prefer it or don't, or whether you are entirely indifferent to it. That sits comfortably, to my mind, within the remit of the Shared Island Initiative and the Good Friday Agreement. Work that I would very much like to continue to be part of, and that must be done as calls for concurrent referendums grow. Fourth, the technical legal focus of the project is fascinating and instructive. As a mere academic lawyer, having ascended to the distinguished ranks of so-called law professor, for which no additional remuneration is attached, I sympathise with the plight of the proper real lawyers on our shared island. There's plainly work to do in joining up legal cooperation. People are not engaging anywhere near enough. Also, another point, underlining again and again the fact that when you say there are legally normative constraints to political conversations, you're not doing that because you want to annoy anyone, political scientists or politicians, or even that you agree with the content of the normative constraints that you're highlighting, but pretending that there are no normative constraints and that the reunification debate in particular is therefore a free-floating blank page discussion seems to me to be ill-advised. As constitutional human rights and equality lawyers know, constraints can be a very good thing indeed. You'll be delighted to hear that I'm reaching my conclusion to my comments. So just to conclude, and with no intention whatsoever to echo W.H. Auden this evening, I'm speaking to you this evening, tonight, from my 9th floor office at Queen's University, Belfast, a university that has known conflict and the conflict. With a panic alarm in my desk drawer to my right, my nameplate removed from my office door, my room details gone from the website of my current employer, and I never thought that I would be giving statements to the PSNI and pondering questions of my own personal security. I do not say that this evening to garner your sympathy or in any way to mask the weakness of my argumentation. I say it for one reason only to you all. Whatever constitutional path this shared island is now on, the absolutely only way forward is through peaceful and democratic means only, and for respect to the fundamental nature of the right to life of everyone who shares this island, through honest dialogue, discussion, and debate about the past, the present, and the future. Your collaborative project, the work that you are doing, is part of that noble exercise for which I commend you all, of promoting informed deliberation. So, I applaud you. I remain willing to be part of it with you all, and I wish you well in your future work. I hope you, and perhaps more importantly, for any funders listening to our constitutional conversation this evening, will build on the work that you have done, the impressive work that you have done, and that others will be encouraged and supported to join in. We really have to overcome the border in the mind that you so often reference in this excellent report. We need to address and answer many of the questions raised here urgently, in my view. And I just want to end by thanking you once again for the kind and generous invitation to participate. I look forward to listening to the views of others and to continuing our conversation. Thank you all so very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Colin. An excellent talk, so well focused, but emphasizing some of the incredible strengths of this report in dealing carefully and sensitively with many issues and emphasizing the connections that need to be made between people, as you say, beyond the physical border and the mental border. And I think everyone will echo your thanks for the contribution that this report has made. So now I'll hand over to Professor Aileen McCarg from the University of Durham, who will offer her reflections. And then I'll give the authors of this report an opportunity to respond before opening it out to the floor. So many thanks. Over to you, Aileen.
Thanks very much, Aileen, and thanks to the organisers for inviting me to participate in this event. I found the report really fascinating. I learned a lot from it. I have to say, I don't know a great deal about the specifics of Irish and Northern Irish law, so it was very interesting. It was really interesting for me to compare and contrast jurisdictional differences on the island of Ireland with those that we find within the UK. Like Colin, I think this is a really valuable project. The coordinators, participants, the funders, all to be very strongly commended. But for me, the key question is, well, what comes next? What do you do with this knowledge about jurisdictional convergence and divergence? So what I want to try and do very briefly is to do three things. I'm going to start by making a couple of comparative points about jurisdictional differences within the UK. I'll then try and draw upon that UK experience to identify where jurisdictional borders might be problematic and what can be done to address them. And finally, since Colin has already said a bit about the Irish unification scenario, I'll say something about how divergence across the Irish border might be handled in the current constitutional context. So in terms of comparison with the UK, the thing that really struck me when reading the report is that the divergences between Ireland and Northern Ireland are said to be primarily statutory rather than common law. So in other words, legal divergence has mainly been the result of political choices, or perhaps political inertia to some extent, rather than being a matter of distinct legal development, or, if you like, legal inheritance. And that contrasts with the UK, where we have more of a mixture. Of course, within the UK, some divergence is political, largely but not exclusively, as a result of legislative devolution. But one might expect that the scope for political divergence would be more constrained within a state than between two states. However, especially between Scotland and the rest of the UK, there are more fundamental legal differences as well. So distinct legal concepts and principles which arise from different legal development pathways. And these apply particularly in private law and criminal law, but in other areas as well. So within the UK, we may have greater divergence where there is actually convergence between Ireland and Northern Ireland, but conversely, we may have convergence where you have divergence. In terms of dealing with those differences between Ireland and Northern Ireland, though, because differences are mainly statutory, then whatever the constitutional context that unfolds, you're going to be primarily talking about political rather than technical legal challenges, although of course there will always be questions of protection of acquired rights to be dealt with in any transitional scenario. The second and maybe blatantly obvious comparative point to make is that the jurisdictional border between Ireland and Northern Ireland is, as things stand, also an international border, and that obviously changes the mechanisms that are available to deal with border problems. So within the UK, ultimately the Westminster Parliament can deal with problems arising from jurisdictional divergence by imposing common legislative solutions. That might come at political cost, but it's something that can be done, which is not an option currently in the island of Ireland. Nevertheless, the UK has had internal jurisdictional borders and hence legal divergence since its inception. So what do we know about the circumstances in which divergence becomes problematic? And I would suggest there's four main situations in which problems can arise. The first is where legal differences inhibit or distort the movement of people across borders. We've seen recent examples of this in the UK, most obviously arising from divergent COVID regulations, but there are also issues around about different university tuition fee regimes which affect student movement. We might have had, although it's just been averted this morning, we might have had issues arising from differential tax rates as well. Second set of problems, and these are obvious as well, can also arise when differences inhibit or distort economic activity, either by raising the cost of doing business or by giving incentives for regulatory competition. Third problem is where differences cause spillover effects and externalities. Classic examples are environmental issues. One of the examples the reports gives in the Irish context is river basin management. But spillover effects can arise in many different contexts whenever decisions made in one jurisdiction impose costs on the other or affect the de facto ability of the other jurisdiction to realise their political and regulatory objectives. And then finally, problems can arise where differences raise perceptions of unequal citizenship. So we might be talking about different human rights protection, different voting rights, different social citizenship rights, different religious freedoms, and so on. These, though, are likely to be more problematic within a single state than they are between states. In all cases, though, whether divergence really is a problem is highly context dependent. The tolerability of differences will depend on a whole range of factors. These might include the scale of the costs and benefits arising from divergence, the relative size of the jurisdictions on either side of the border and their respective ability to absorb costs, the strength of countervailing pressures or constraints which support or produce divergence, the political salience of divergence problems, and also cultural factors like language, which affect the porousness of a particular border. And actually, divergence might be less problematic in practice than we might think. I was thinking about the common frameworks analysis that was conducted in the UK following Brexit as a kind of an instructive example. That was an exercise to map the areas where EU law intersected with devolved competences in one or more parts of the UK. And there were 152 areas of intersecting competences identified. But ultimately, it was concluded that in 120 of those 152 areas of intersection, no action of any sort was required following Brexit to deal with potential divergence between the UK devolved institutions once their common obligation to comply with EU law had been lifted. Now, that conclusion was somewhat undercut subsequently by the enactment of the UK Internal Market Act 2020, which does put in place general mechanisms to reduce barriers to doing business throughout the UK, which might arise from different regulatory choices at UK devolved levels. Nevertheless, the UK Internal Market Act doesn't capture all divergences, even in relation to economic activities. And actually, before we joined what was then the EEC in 1973, there was nothing equivalent. There were very, very few legal supports either for free trade or for free movement within the UK, notwithstanding that there had been legislative devolution in Northern Ireland, and notwithstanding some quite significant differences between Scots and English law in areas of commercial law and business regulation. So the UK has always been and still is willing to tolerate quite high degrees of legal divergence. In addition, even where divergence is identified as being potentially problematic, there are multiple ways of dealing with it, and the suitability of different mechanisms will again be context dependent. Mechanisms can range from simple information sharing processes through informal regulatory harmonisation to ad hoc negotiation. And then you can have a range of more formal mechanisms, formal dispute resolution mechanisms, formal regulatory harmonisation, mutual recognition and or non-discrimination regimes like the UK Internal Market Act, or even administrative coordination bodies like the 6 North-South implementation bodies established under the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. So that takes me quite nicely to my last issue. How does all this play out in the context of the Irish border? Now, as the report acknowledges, border effects between Ireland and Northern Ireland are not new, as is inevitably the case along any international border. But while the Irish border is perhaps a particularly porous border, it's also one where there is quite a lot of experience of and machinery for dealing with cross-border issues, as I've just noted. So I think we can probably be fairly confident that problems arising from legal divergence can be dealt with if the political will to do so is there. And I recognise that is a big if, potentially. In terms of mechanisms for dealing with border problems, what we're talking about post-Brexit is a reduction in the scope of general legal mechanisms for dealing with cross-border effects, and hence a greater need for ad hoc solutions to particular issues. And as I said, what types of mechanisms might be suitable will depend on the issues, and I'm not really qualified to comment in detail. But just one last point that I want to make is the importance of governance arrangements for cross-border cooperation. Intergovernmental negotiations, intergovernmental machinery have a very strong tendency to bypass democratic participation and accountability and to be non-transparent. But actually, the existing mechanisms for North-South cooperation on the island of Ireland are unusually formal and unusually institutionalised, and that can help to reduce accountability and transparency problems, albeit it doesn't eliminate them altogether. So my final thought is that I think it is important to try to resist any temptation to bypass those structures in favour of wholly kind of ad hoc arrangements, unless there is in a particular situation, particularly strong reasons for doing so. There might be in some circumstances. For instance, the single electricity market has a quite different governance structure for particular reasons. But in general, I think that existing structure is going to be built upon rather than starting afresh where cooperative mechanisms are required. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aileen. It was great to get the perspective from the UK, from England, from Scotland, all in one. So a neighbouring perspective, but also looking at Ireland and Northern Ireland somewhat from the outside. So I think that it would be wonderful now to give the authors of this report, if they wish, an opportunity to respond or to reflect on the process of writing the report. And I think Aileen has asked, a very large question, the what next question. That may not be one you can answer right here and now, but it might be one on which you want to offer some interim comments. So if any of you would like to respond to some of these comments and on the writing of the approach of the report, you would be very welcome. So am I?
Chris and then Fionnuala, and then I'll.
Oh, right. Okay. Chris.
First.
Yes. Thank you, Warren. Chris.
Thanks. So first of all, thank you to the funders. This wouldn't have happened without them, and to the authors of the specific area and subject matter reports. Again, the overarching report that we've prepared is highly dependent on the specifics, and we're really grateful to those authors, some of whom are present today. I also like to thank members of the steering group, who've, I think we've all worked interestingly together, and it provides an interesting example of the potential for cross-border work, but particularly Oren Doyle for bringing us all together originally, and for being our leader and urging us on at the right moments. So thank you, Oren. I really appreciate it. Could I raise just 3 points from what Aileen and Colin have already said, just to emphasize them a bit more. The first point, I think, is that if we're serious about achieving greater understanding of each other's systems, whether or not that's a prelude to a unity referendum or not, then there needs to be increased in-depth academic research and engagement across the island. And I think it's noticeable that the last time this kind of effort was undertaken was way back in the 1980s, when Des Greer and Kevin Boyle were asked by the Forum to do something a little similar. But certainly from our researchers, there hasn't been an attempt since then to do an overarching examination of divergence and convergence. So I think that, the report, I think, has identified a significant gap in academic research. Second point really relates back to Aileen's point about the idea of legal pluralism. So there's clearly extensive legal pluralism on the island of Ireland, and that's now a feature of legal life. If that legal pluralism is not to lead to increased fragmentation in everyday life, then there needs to be mechanisms for addressing those areas of law where divergence is most problematic. And I take the point that legal pluralism is not necessarily in any way a bad thing, but where it leads to fragmentation, which is problematic, then I think it does need to be addressed. And that's at the level both of policy and at the technical legal level. So it's not just a political issue, it's also a legal issue. And I think it's worth, reflecting that in several of the contexts that we currently operate, law is used as a potential mechanism for bringing about greater convergence. So that's the second point, that there need to be mechanisms, and it's really echoing Eilín's point. The third is really addressing the questions of where that legal discussion should take place or can take place. And I take the point about the north-south bodies, but there is something that is perhaps worth pointing out, which is the absence of judicial conversation between North and South, at least as evidenced by the lack of cross-border citation by judges of one jurisdiction in terms of what's going on in the other jurisdiction, even where that's relevant. And I think that's noticeable and can be relatively easily addressed if there's an awareness that it may be desirable for particularly legal practitioners, North and South, to be aware of what's going on in the other jurisdiction. The other element that's connected to this question about increasing conversation between North and South at the legal level is the absence, certainly in Northern Ireland, of engagement with legal developments in the South generally. And I can't speak to what's happening in the Republic, but it's certainly noticeable in Northern Ireland that there is this lack of engagement until relatively recently, and in very isolated areas like abortion and same-sex marriage. But apart from that, the circumstances of a conversation are really relatively limited. And that's not helped by the effective suspension of bodies like the Law Commission in Northern Ireland, which could have engaged with equivalent bodies in the South. And that, I think, turns out to have been a substantial mistake in retrospect. So I'll leave it at that, but particularly thank you to Colin and Eilín. So I've been merely dropping footnotes to their excellent presentations, for which we're grateful.
Thank you, Chris. That's really helpful. And it does highlight the role that universities can play, not just in wonderful reports like this and in-depth scholarship, but also in bringing people together. Our job is, after all, to engage in conversations. And I think maybe those judicial and academic and practitioner conversations can go forward in a university setting, potentially. So Professor Oren Doyle from Trinity.
So thanks, Aileen. Thanks to other Aileen and to Colin for your comments, which are very much appreciated and help us think about how we, what we might do next with this. I thought I might just sort of build on those and think about the future a little bit in terms of where the funding has come from. So as been mentioned several times, we're very grateful to the Irish Research Council and to the Shared Island Unit of the Department of An Taoiseach. And the funding comes through a stream called New Foundations, which is, it's about sort of pilot projects, exploring the ground, establishing networks. So it's all about setting the foundation for future research. So it's appropriate. What have we learned from this project in that sense? Well, I think the first thing that we've learned is that the terrain is vast. Something which we sort of knew before we started, which are probably always overly ambitious as you start on something, but it becomes clear that if you want to do, you could write, and people have written a 2,000-page book on Irish tort law and not be covering everything. You could write a similar book on Northern Irish tort law, and you put the two together, you've got a bigger book, and do that across multiple areas of law, and you come up with a vast compendium of knowledge, but it probably needs for any meaningful project, it needs a bit more direction and a bit more focus. And I think so that's something that came through as we worked through the various papers. So I think the approach taken in the papers was to pick out 1 or 2 or 3 particular areas that the authors knew to be salient and important, and on the basis of that, try to identify some trends. And on the basis of that, we've built up the overall report. So I think there's valuable and true information and knowledge in there, but obviously it's subject to those limitations. So where do you find the focus from then for future work, which we all seem to think is necessary? So I think in terms of Aileen's comments, partly it comes from the fact that the salience of convergence and divergence will vary from area to area. It very much depends on the context. In some areas, divergence may be problematic. In other areas, divergence is not at all problematic. May depend on, well, partly depends on what the constitutional future is. But if the constitutional future, as Aileen was looking at it, remains the same as current, that there isn't a change to the status of Northern Ireland, then the relevance of the legal border between the 2 jurisdictions will vary, probably depending on the amount of movement across that border and various ways for managing legal differences where there is movement. So the conclusion, I think, building on that we came to in the report, was that generally speaking, work of this type would be better pursued, not in the sort of compendious way we've attempted here, but with a more precise subject area focus, where experts from the 2 jurisdictions in one particular area would understand the salience of convergence and divergence, and would be able to formulate research projects that were appropriate for that area. And we hope that this project has helped to build up some of the networks, just the knowledge of people and who's working in your area that may not have been there before, that has opened up avenues for comparison and productive academic research that we may not have known existed, and that will hopefully have its own life after this project is over. And we will need to keep provoking conversations. So we'll be taking this on a roadshow, I suppose. We're bringing it to the Irish Association of Law Teachers Conference in Belfast in November, hoping to talk to law academics north and south about this, to try to get them interested in the idea of north-south comparison. As we're talking, or as Chris was talking, I was wondering, should we be bringing it to the Judicial Studies Institute in the south as a way of raising some of the issues with judges? And I'm sure there are similar bodies in the north, but I think there's ways in which we can bring the report to try to provoke those conversations further. The other constitutional future focused on by Colin is the possibility of unification, legitimate aspiration under the Good Friday Agreement, one where it certainly seems far more likely than it did in the past that we will at least face unification referendums. And without anticipating the result of those referendums, I think we can uncontroversially say that it is good to be prepared for those referendums. Referendums that are not prepared for can have problematic consequences. And that's where we feel there is scope for more focused, or for a project that would look at a number of north-south areas, and essentially around what it would take to merge 2 legal systems. There's a lot of consideration and debates about unification now, about merging 2 political systems, and does devolution continue or does it not continue? But very little focus on the nuts and bolts of merging 2 legal systems, and then a spillover into areas such as citizenship and other areas of public law. And we think there probably is sufficient subject matter commonality to warrant further focused study, as opposed to leaving it to subject area experts to see where to advance work. So that's sort of, the question was asked, what's the future? So that's my own personal reflections on it, that may or may not be fully shared by my co-authors. I don't want to speak entirely for them, but I do want to thank them for their work on the project. That's Chris, David and Fionnuala who'll be speaking momentarily. To thank again the funders, Irish Research Council, Shared Island Unit and the Department of An Taoiseach, and to thank all of the authors who are busy completing their papers as we speak. And the papers themselves will appear in the ARINS series over the next 6 months. So if you want to see the more detailed legal scholarship that has underpinned this report, you'll see it coming out in that series over the next 6 months. So thanks.
Thanks, Oren. Some interesting ideas there for moving forward, both at the detailed, focused level and in terms of those broader themes. So I see my colleague, Professor David Kenny there, and Professor Fionnuala Ní Éileán. Would you like to also offer some thoughts at this moment, at this juncture, in relation to the report? Fionnuala, I see your camera has come on there.
Thank you. Thanks, Aileen. So just to say, first of all, to note and re-echo Chris's thanks to the funders. It takes a funder to help prompt us to get together and enable the kind of work that's been done. And I think the range of funders engaged in this project illustrates the range of potential stakeholders who value the process and the work itself. I, like Chris, want to particularly acknowledge the team of us, but I really do want to say a particular thanks to Oren, who on multiple time zones kept us on track over the past year and really provided the continuity of vision and practicality to keep this on the road. So many, many thanks to him, as well as to the authors. And I would say just three short points. One is just to underscore this point about the deep resonance and value of this kind of, if you want, engaged technical work that is often undervalued in academia itself, as well as undervalued in terms of the kinds of resources that go to it, both in terms of furthering this kind of important collaborative, interjurisdictional comparative work, but also within the academy often struggles to be seen. And so I do think that one of the things that this report also does is speak to the sort of the resonance and the value of supporting this work and the need for more of it, frankly. And I don't want to, many of us who are also on this project do a lot of, I would say, macro level thinking about some of these issues theoretically, but it has to be underpinned by this commitment to evidence-based, doctrinal, expert legal analysis, which I think we've had luckily a surfeit of in this project. I think the other thing I would say there, echoing Colin's remarks, is the point that to do this kind of legal work is and to have it valued and not undermined as a political matter, to understand that doing this work is in itself important to all potential outcomes and not doesn't close off any of them, I think is a matter that all of the authors and stakeholders in the project feel particularly important about, particularly strongly about. The second point which follows from that is one that I think we were all conscious of in pulling the speakers and the authors in, which is the diversity of voices that we need to have this kind of conversation on the island of Ireland. And I think we recognize that the nature of the project brought in subject matter experts, but we recognize too that there are a variety of other stakeholders in these conversations, many of them who often do not have access to the kind of elite spaces in which these conversations take place, but where the regulatory impact of analysis of convergence and divergence actually impacts on individual lives in really significant ways. And so I think looking forward and picking up on Oren's remark, is there was another piece of moving, whether it's the subject matter work in particular areas forward or the larger project pieces of it forward, is actually a commitment by all of four of us to enlarging the group of voices and the diversities who are present in the legal conversations, and ensuring, particularly not just as we do assessment, but as we think about what the impact of that doctrinal assessment is on individuals. And the third thing I would just underscore is just, it was really clear to me personally, and many of the people who, the authors who were part of this report, we knew each other, but many of us actually, because of the border, don't engage as much as we should. And I think we were all struck by how few formal and informal opportunities exist for us to engage with one another. It's much easier to go to a Law and Society conference in Toronto than it is to find all kinds of ways for scholars on the island of Ireland to engage with each other in sustained, systematic and long-term ways that are actually supported and are incentivized, where there's an investment into a culture of shared knowledge on the island, whatever the constitutional future of the island would be. And I think if anything comes out of this project, it ought to be the idea that actually investment in that kind of shared knowledge, whether it's judicial or institutional or normative, is extraordinarily important. And for those who celebrate the Jewish New Year, it's the Jewish New Year right now. Shana Tova to all of you. And I would say it reminds us that maybe it's a good time to think about new beginnings, but also to sort of think of those beginnings as inclusive beginnings that allow these kinds of conversations to be embedded and not one-off conversations. So thanks to all.
Perhaps also repentance, Fionnuala.
Repentance is good too. Yom Kippur is next Tuesday. So, yes, actually this week, it's Wednesday. So there we go.
Aileen, if I could just drop a footnote
Sure.
to points that have been made, which I echo strongly, and absolutely committed to the academic input into this. But it would be, I think, important also to emphasize the need for more cross-border practitioner involvement. Your point about the universities, as it were, being a forum for potentially bringing together both practitioners and judges is, I think, well taken. I mean, you're sitting in Trinity on a superb example of this in terms of the Irish Centre for European Law, which of course has an important north-south dimension to it. Does bring together practitioners, judges, and academics, I think, in a remarkably productive way. And this is sort of by way of an ad that the Irish Centre is going to be, as we're developing a Northern Ireland specific branch for precisely these purposes of bringing a lot more of this conversation to take place. But this role for the universities, I think, illustrated by the Irish Centre, I think, is a potentially interesting model for us to think through more in a more sustained way.
Wonderful. Thanks, Chris. And definitely we in TriCON, in the Trinity Centre for Constitutional Governance, are very committed to this kind of work as well. These practitioner academic conversations, judicial conversations, and definitely reaching out beyond borders, both in the mind, as Colin said earlier, and in reality. David, would you like to make some comments at this point?
Thanks so much, Aileen. I don't want to detain anyone or take any additional time, given, I think, the excellent comments of my co-authors. So I'll just add my thanks to the funders, my co-authors, and all of our participants in the workshops for the really terrific work that was done. It was an honor to be involved. We have about sort of 10 minutes if anyone has any questions, and people can feel free to type out a question in the questions and answers function or in the chat, and we can be very happy to put that question across. I did, if it's okay, I sort of had a question that I wanted to put to the assembled group, which is, I think that we've noted in various ways the potential to do further engagement with different groups, both in terms of the judiciary and legal practice, and encouraging cross-border cooperation in those spheres. Just in terms of whether or not there is work to be done on sort of building out infrastructure in that respect, do we think that universities are a linchpin there, or do we need to sort of, while encouraging all this, step back and try and allow various representative bodies to build those links, outside of the context of academic discussion, very much in the mold that suits their particular priorities and frameworks? I suppose my question is our project here cognate but separate to projects that have to be done in relation to legal practice and the judiciary, or is it all one and the same?
Great question, David. Would any of the authors of the report, or indeed any of the commentators, wish to give an answer to that question? Please just leap in if you are. My own sense is that universities have an important role to play here, and that this report is emblematic of public service scholarship in the best possible kind, where we're drawing on our expertise over many years and investing them in trying to solve or move forward with a problem that could hardly be more important. So I think universities must have a role to play, but I think you know, one of the points maybe underpinning your question, David, is presumably that it can't be the only or the focal point of all such engagements. We need some civic engagement, which Colin mentioned at the outset. Would any other of the authors like to offer a reflection on that?
I mean, maybe just to say, Fionnuala speaking here, that it is, I think there is this important and sort of driving role that academics and universities can play. But I think the other piece of this, which is really articulated in the very practical work of this project, which really has to involve the practitioners of law. And I think part of the challenge is that often, while some universities do a great job at doing that, there's a kind of a sustained piece of structural work that has to be done over the long term to engage those practitioners in a way that actually incentivizes and sees the value for their practice, their long-term practice of doing this work. And so I think that really requires a shift out of thinking of these things as somewhat academic exercises that just academics have the time and capacity to do, and to think about what it would mean to realign that discussion around the sort of very practical needs of the profession in its multiple dimensions, north and south, over.
And the implication of that, I think, just to jump in, Chris McCrudden, is that the role of the universities isn't just in terms of research, it's also in terms of teaching. I think so far there's been a dearth of serious teaching engagement north-south on issues of common interest. So even where the research has been done, it often hasn't really percolated as extensively as it might into in discussions of curriculum and curriculum reform.
Mm-hmm. And even one simple place to start would be the odd visiting lecture between those of us in the Republic and those in Northern Ireland, to expose our students to these different perspectives, you know, as an initial step. Anybody else on this, on the way in which we as academics should engage or could engage with practitioners, which is obviously a key part of this jigsaw? Colin?
Don't have really anything other to say than agree with what's being said. I just, in my talk, tried to underline a recognition of the limitations of universities. We can be very, very useful in terms of promoting conversations, but we have our limits ourselves in terms of the restrictions. But it's really just to, you know, for you, we all know this already, all the talk of shared island and the here and now, we're just not talking to each other on the island now. We haven't been doing for years. So any institutional framework that can promote those discussions, whether that be universities or other bodies or professional connections, there's often been a very strong willingness to do that in the north, but to be candid, sometimes you meet some resistance in the south from building those sorts of connections. So I'm sure I speak for my colleagues here. We're more delighted to accept invitations to give visiting lectures in the south, and you'll see from your project, you know, ultimately what you've been doing is bringing people together, and that has been very, very productive and good. And just echo again, commend what you've been doing. My view is we need more of that to be happening across the board, but it needs to be funded and supported. And if it's not resourced, it's all risks being sort of hot air. But my second point is, you know, I haven't made any secret about where I think things are going. I know a number of you are involved in these discussions. I think we're probably heading towards these referendums, and, you know, the legal political thing that I talked about, you know, which, you know, I'm preaching to people here who know this much better than me, is that, you know, the legal side of that is underdeveloped. And what you've said in the report about a public law project, for example, to take forward specific preparatory work on constitutional change, I think is really urgent. And so if there's any funders listening to our call this evening and have tuned in, this work needs to be significantly resourced. The ambition of the Shared Island Unit needs to be significantly enhanced. And that work and all the work you're doing falls comfortably within the remit of, you know, all those various funding projects. But you do need resources to take this stuff forward, I think.
There's actually a question from an attendee, which I think links in with that. And I think we have time to deal with this one at least, which I think relates to this in asking to what extent do governments have a role in actively taking on the question of looking at legal convergence and divergence beyond funding projects, or is that the primary responsibility of governments in that way? And I think a related question directed toward Aileen McHarg at the role to which, or the extent to which the government in London encourages any engagement with questions of divergence and convergence with the very different legal system in Scotland, to what extent that is a priority for the London government to look at in any way or not.
Right, so there's a specific question to Aileen, but a broader question about the responsibility of the governments here. Anyone want to take the general first, very briefly and quickly, and then we'll go to Aileen?
Can I just echo something I said in the comments there? You know, it just seems to me remarkable that you have political parties on the island and you have a government on the island that's constitutionally committed to a particular outcome and can't answer some basic questions around it. Well, you know, so if you're a political party in government that's committed to a particular constitutional outcome that the Irish state is already constitutionally obligated towards, the lack of preparation seems to me just remarkable, particularly post-Brexit, and particularly the dynamics that are happening on the island. So if governments have a role in this, yes, it's funding things, but it's also eventually somebody's going to have to put a prospectus in front of people. An Irish government's going to have a major role in that. And, you know, there's a real need for political leadership as well as civic leadership. And unfortunately, at the minute, some of that is absent, in my view, personal view. Thank you.
Maybe I will just add, I think it'd be slightly different. I think governments will play their role. I think, and I think the challenge of channeling all this through government is often we end up with more closed and politically driven engagements than we need in this space, because I think what is driving this project is the idea that actually there's an enormous amount of practical work to be done, which is actually both can inform government, but actually might some of it be well done separate from government, not least because it's more likely to be inclusive, more likely to be less exclusionary, more likely not to be seen. It would be that linguistic decommissioning, perhaps, is another words we might use here, that it doesn't create a set of presumptions. And I think it's very, very difficult once governments become involved not to assume the presumptions that go with either particular constitutional histories or particular contemporary positioning by a state. So for me personally, and I don't speak for my co-authors, I think the kind of enriching of this space, the funding of this space, so that actually you make this space as big, as diverse, as open, as thoughtful, and as expert as possible, seems to me to be in the first instance what might then lead governments to do other things. But actually the precursor is to produce outcomes that are really rich and textured and inclusive. We need to really enrich and deepen this space that I think this group of authors and this project was trying to open up. And I see Chris might have more to say than that.
No, I agree entirely with Fionnuala on this. I mean, I think it's very important that we don't assume that the only funders here are government funders. I mean, I strongly welcome the Shared Island Initiative's involvement here. and I'm not attempting in any way to not to value that. But there are other funders, and I think it's extremely important in this kind of area that this kind of project not be seen to be captured by any particular government or any particular agenda, not least because I don't need to say to this audience, I'm assuming that particularly in the North, these issues are really extraordinarily sensitive. And echoing Finuala's point about the importance of a diverse range of voices, that diverse range of voices will be squeezed out and will opt out if it's seen to be captured for a particular agenda. So for that reason, if for no other, the diversity of funders is as important, I think, as the diversity of participants.
Wonderful. Thanks, Chris. So I see that we're just at the edge of our time, but maybe Aileen McCarg, if you want to respond quickly to the Scotland question before we, sadly, in a way, have to round up.
So I think it's kind of relatively easy to answer this question. I mean, Scotland is a much smaller legal jurisdiction than England and Wales. Scots lawyers have always felt neglected by Westminster, and that neglect of the legal system was a powerful technical argument for devolution. But devolution is only a partial solution to that problem. There are still issues of Scots law that are handled at Westminster. For many years after devolution, we had a kind of devolve and forget attitude. That has changed insofar as the UK government is now much more willing to involve itself in devolved areas, but it does so from a position, from my perspective, of still relative ignorance. However, I think where technical issues arise, these are kind of irritating when they arise, but they're not so difficult to deal with as where divergent legal rules embody fundamentally different political choices. And that's the issues, I think, that are much harder to deal with. And to go back to one of the earlier questions about how you handle these kind of divergence issues, it really depends on the context. What is the reason? What is the nature of the divergence that arises? What are the interests that surround it? Who are the stakeholders? What does divergence mean to them? Is it just a technical question of finding some sort of harmonized solution, or are you actually facing, fundamentally entrenched political positions? And those will inevitably require different handling. Thank you.
Thanks, Aileen. I'll just round up briefly by saying thank you and congratulations again to the authors of this report and the academic and practical collaboration that they've set up and put in motion. There's a strong sense in this seminar that something is moving forward. We need to do more on many different fronts, and as Finuala said, with plural voices. But it's impressive. This report is impressive, and congratulations to Oren for moving it forward, driving it forward. I would say. I would just, as the director of TriCON, say that we are absolutely committed to doing what we can to further those conversations and engage beyond borders. So thanks to all of you who have come and listened. It's been a fascinating discussion, the first of many, I hope. So thanks again and congratulations. Thanks also to our commentators. Until the next time.
Thank you very much.
Slán gur maithfidh.
Slán.
Slán.